The Gemara tells a story that relates to what we've started to learn. We've started by asking the question that when Hashem punishes the Egyptians by taking all of their wealth and giving it to the Jewish people, is the objective mainly to punish the Egyptians, or is the objective mainly to enrich the Jewish people because they've been through slavery? So Gemara tells a story. Turns out that there are quite a number of stories in the Gemara relating to Alexander the Great, because it appears that when Alexander the Great came with the intention of conquering the land of Israel, he very quickly came to realize that he actually was firstly protected by the spiritual giant of the time, Shimon HaTzadik, and there was a whole story with that, and he comes actually in peace. And being a student of philosophy, as Alexander the Great was, he's quite intrigued by the Jewish sages and the Jewish way of thinking. So there's all these stories recorded in the Gemara about their interactions. One of the stories is that a delegation from Egypt comes to Alexander the Great with a complaint against the Jews. And the complaint is that when the Jews left Egypt all those centuries earlier, they took the wealth. And the context in the Torah is that Hashem tells the Jewish people that they have to ask their neighbors for all the gold and silver because they're going to serve God in the desert for 3 days. So almost giving the impression that they're going to bring the things back. And obviously they don't. So the Egyptians have this very strong complaint that the Jews are thieves and they've stolen all of our wealth centuries ago, and now it's payback. They've got to return everything that they've taken. Now the Jewish people were quite concerned about this because, who's Alexander the Great likely to side with in a story like this? It sounds like they have a very strong case, and it's going to cost the Jewish community untold fortunes, and how they're going to deal with it. So there's a guy in the community at the time called Gavia ben Pesisa, and he happened to be a hunchback. And he says to the community, he says, you know what, I'll go and represent the Jewish community in front of Alexander the Great, and there's nothing to worry about, because if I lose the case, people will say, okay, he's just a hunchback. He's not like a leader of the community. And if I win the case, well, that'll obviously be good for everybody, because, So Gavia ben Pesisa goes in front of the court. Alexander the Great presides, and he says, listen, you guys claim that we took all of that wealth from you, and we acknowledge that that is true. We took all the wealth from you. However, what you have not taken into consideration is that you had a workforce of 600,000 adult males who were your slaves for 210 years without compensation. So what we really need to do now is we need to calculate the value of all of those years of labor. And whatever that amount is, that's what Egypt owes us. And you owe it to us from centuries ago, so we have to add compound interest. Well, let's calculate. I suspect that not only do we not have to return what we took, but you probably still owe us much more than what we took. And the Gemara concludes that the Egyptian delegation literally ran off with their tail between their legs, and that was the end of the conversation. Now, the reason that this is important to our discussion is because it contextualizes why it is that we got all that wealth. You can hear it in his argument. He's basically saying, you owed us the money. The reason that the Israelites left with gold and with silver, the Gemara says that there was not one Jew who left Egypt with less than 15 donkeys laden with wealth or treasures, whatever it was that they got out of Egypt. So it sounds very clear from this story that the objective, the reason that they got all of that wealth was because it was owed to them. So that comes from the angle that this is reparations. Remember, there's two possible angles. Either the reason that the Jews have to take all of the wealth is because the Egyptians need to be punished, and the way they're going to be punished is we're going to destroy their economy, but practically that money is going to go somewhere, so the most suitable candidates would be the Jews because they suffered. Or the reason that the Jews get the wealth is because the Jews have suffered, and therefore they are deserving of compensation. And of course, where's that compensation going to come from? It's going to come from Egypt. So the question is, which one is it? This story of Gevir ben Pesisa and Alexander the Great, that illustrates that there's a strong argument to say the reason that the Jewish people had to have wealth was as compensation for all of the years of the suffering as slaves. Now, depending on which perspective we take, because again, there's two possibilities. Do we prioritize the punishment of Egypt, or do we prioritize the reparations to the Jewish people? So, depending on which angle we take, that will determine how the exercise had to play out. In other words, if the goal is to punish Egypt, because Egypt misbehaved and they mistreated the Jewish people, and maybe they even overstepped their mandate, because their mandate was that they should enslave the Jewish people, and maybe they did more than just enslave us. They threw children in the Nile and they beat everybody. Maybe that wasn't part of their mandate. So they deserve punishment, and the punishment is that they have to lose their financial stability. If that is the case, that we're prioritizing the punishment of Egypt, then the means by which that money lands up at the Jews is irrelevant. In other words, if Hashem had sent, for example, another invading nation who chased the Egyptians out, and they just left all their wealth behind, that'd be fine, because the fact is that the Jews would get the wealth. Or if Hashem had sent, as one of the 10 plagues, a powerful epidemic that killed everybody, and therefore as a result all of their assets were lying around unguarded, and therefore the Jews got the money, that would be fine, because the fact is the Egyptians had been punished. So if I'm coming from that angle where the goal is the punishment of the Egyptians, then it is good enough to get the money to the Jewish people in any which way possible. However, if the goal is that the Jews have to be compensated for all of the years that they suffered, then the transfer of funds has to feel like compensation. It's a big difference. Certainly psychologically it's a big difference. So again, let's say for argument's sake that a person had somebody damaged their property. If your insurance pays out, so it doesn't necessarily feel like you've punished the perpetrator. You've been compensated. And even though you've been compensated, it doesn't feel like the perpetrator has in any way made right on what happened. Whereas if the insurance puts pressure on the perpetrator to pay out of pocket for the damage that they've done, you feel psychologically satisfied. Well, okay, this is somebody who misbehaved, and now I feel that they've done something. There's some show of goodwill, and there's some kind of compensation that actually makes me feel a little bit more decent about what happened. Now, Hashem's promise to the Jewish people, or at least Hashem's promise to Avraham about what would happen to the Jewish people, was that after the period of slavery, they would leave with great wealth. In order to fulfill, to honor that promise, the method of transfer of funds is irrelevant. The main thing is they get the money. And so if it turns out that the way they're getting the money is with the emphasis on punishing the Egyptians, that's fine, because he's fulfilled his promise. That's what the Midrash that we learned yesterday is teaching us. The Midrash says that when it was time for Hashem, before Moshe even left Midian to go to Egypt, to undertake this mission, to take the Jews out of Egypt, before any of that happens, Hashem tells Moshe these words: "V'nosati eschein ha'am be'enei Mitzrayim." I'm going to create a situation where the Egyptians, who for 200 years mistreated the Jewish people, probably hated the Jewish people, that's going to change, and they're suddenly going to have a favorable attitude towards the Jewish people. That's what the verse says. The Midrash tells us that the reason for that verse is because Hashem does not want a scenario where Avraham is going to turn around and have a pischoin peh. He's going to have an argument, he's going to have a complaint against Hashem. What's the complaint? You fulfilled the part of the promise that you're going to enslave them. You haven't fulfilled the part of the promise that you're going to make them wealthy. Now, the Midrash is telling us something very important over here. It's telling us it's not simply that Abraham might complain that you haven't given them the money that they deserve based on your promise when you promised them that they were going to get money. Something else is happening over here. Chen. What does it mean when somebody sees you from the perspective of chen, what does that tell you? That tells you something about the relationship. That tells you that this isn't purely transactional. I owe you something, and therefore I'm going to give it to you. That tells you that there's a certain degree of connection, that there's a certain degree of emotional attachment. Now, why is that an important part of the story? That's what the Midrash is telling us. The Midrash says, in order to discharge his responsibility, because Hashem made a promise that the Jews are going to be wealthy, any which way that the Jews became wealthy after the Exodus would have been good enough. But what would the Jews have felt as people? If, let's say, for example, they left Egypt and they turn around the next corner and there's a gold mine that nobody's ever found before. Okay, so now we're wealthy, but psychologically they wouldn't feel that there's any link between that and the fact that they're being compensated for all of the years of the slavery. Now, Avraham, and this is what the Midrash emphasizes, Avraham is Avinu. He's our father. That's why the Midrash uses that expression. It says, we're worried that Avraham Avinu, that our father Avraham is going to have a complaint. Why do we need to know in this context that he's our father? For exactly that reason. Because what does a father care about? The well-being of the child. But not just the well-being of the child in the sense that you've got money in the bank. Any parent will tell you that it's not good enough just to feel the satisfaction or the security that your children are financially secure. It's very important. It's obviously something we want. But we also want, and we want even more than that our children should feel good. Not just that they should have what they need. They should be in a healthy, solid psychological state. Now, Avraham is our father, and he says, look, Hashem, for whatever reason it is, you have decided that history has to unfold with the Jews spending centuries in slavery. And while maybe Avraham does or doesn't see the value of why that has to happen, he certainly acknowledges that if that's what Hashem wants, then that's obviously the correct thing to go through. But he says, afterwards, how are they going to feel? Are they going to feel like that was a horrible chapter, thank God it's over, and now there's a fresh chapter, and we're starting this chapter with a lot of wealth, so that's good? Or are they going to feel that somebody cared about their suffering? That somebody actually looked to give reparations, to compensate them for what they had been through? So this is what Hashem wants to clarify. I'm not simply putting money in the bank. There's going to be chen. There's going to be a shift in the attitude of the Egyptians, where the Egyptians are effectively going to come around and recognize that they have to do something to compensate the Jews for all of this time that they've been there. In other words, the Midrash is clarifying for us that the primary objective of taking all of the wealth away from Egypt and giving it to the Jewish people is not primarily to punish the Egyptians. It's primarily to satisfy the Jews. It's primarily to compensate the Jews. And the reason for this is because we don't want Avraham Avinu, our father, to say, but you haven't made us feel like we've been given something to deal with what we've been through. So that's why chen is a critical part. The attitude. It's almost like, if you can imagine, just think about what it must have been like as a Jewish person for all of these years, the way that you've grown up, your parents have grown up, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, is every single morning you wake up to be abused. And then one day, the Egyptians all change their tune. And they come over and they say, we feel really bad about what's happened, and we want to compensate you. You probably wouldn't even know what to do with this information, to be so overwhelming and so satisfying. And that's what Avraham wants. But then the Gemara comes along and says, even that's not good enough. And the reason that's not good enough is because, again, if we go back to human psychology, one of the things that people always feel uncomfortable with, and we know this from our own experience, is when somebody does something for you because they feel bad for you. It's uncomfortable. Don't do me any favors. Don't treat me like some kind of a nebuch that you're going to come along and say, look, I'm so sorry for what happened. Here's, have a lollipop. It's going to make you feel a little bit better. Every person wants to feel that they've earned their keep. And that's why we have an expression in the Torah that we use, which is you don't want to have nahama dechisufa, which is the bread of shame. The bread of shame is when you receive a handout. So you've got bread, but it's embarrassing. The reason I'm eating is because somebody felt bad for me and they decided they're going to, it's a whole different discussion, but when people win the lottery, so it's a great feeling, right? Everybody who's never won the lottery is absolutely convinced that it must be the most amazing thing to win the lottery. And I'm happy to experiment and try and see if that's the case. But the statistics are that people who win the lottery, in the majority of cases, are less happy after the win than they were before the win, which is fascinating, right? And that's besides the fact that the statistics also illustrate that a very large portion of lottery winners end up losing the money because they don't really have the financial know-how. But that's not what we're focusing on. We're focusing more on the fact that there's a tremendous satisfaction. The way that human beings are wired is that we have a tremendous satisfaction when we've worked and achieved and earned something, much more than when we get a gift. So a gift is beautiful, but there's nothing that gives us the kind of nachas as working hard and achieving something. So now you've got a scenario where the Jewish people have been slaves for 210 years, and they deserve to be compensated, and they're going to be compensated because that was a divine promise. And they're not only going to be compensated, but they're going to be compensated with chen, which means that the Egyptians are going to change their tune and they're going to behave very nicely towards them and show respect and whatever the case is. And it's possible that the Jews could still walk out of there feeling, I don't feel like I was compensated for what I did. I was compensated for what happened to me, but I wasn't compensated for what I did. In other words, I worked hard for all of these years, as did my parents, as my grandparents, as did my great-grandparents. We don't want just some kind of a gold watch. We want an acknowledgement that this is being given to us to appreciate and acknowledge what we did. That's the human psychology. So therefore the Gemara says, actually, not only are the Jews going to be paid, and that's the primary focus. The focus is not punishing Egypt. The focus is reparations for the Jews. And not only are they going to be paid in such a way that it feels menschlich, because the Egyptians approach them with an attitude of chen, where they're gracious towards them. But more than that, the Gemara notes that, not in this week's parasha, but in 2 weeks' time, when we get to the story of the Exodus, Hashem is going to tell Moshe, to tell the Jewish people, please ask your neighbors to give you their stuff. See the difference? In the first scenario, the neighbors are happily giving their stuff with chen. In a second scenario, we're asking them and then they're giving us the stuff. There is a massive psychological difference between the two scenarios. In the first scenario, they're the nice people and we're the wretched recipients. Yes, they have chen, and they are not just simply, or Hashem didn't simply create a mechanism where we get their money. They're actually giving it to us, and even with a sense of enthusiasm and willingly. But we still are the nebuchs. We're still the people on the dole. Whereas by the time it gets to that point that they're going to actually receive the wealth, Hashem says, I want you to tell the Jews to ask their neighbors for the wealth. What does it mean when you ask for something? So the Rambam tells us, it was actually the Rambam the last couple of days, when you hire somebody to do a job, the Torah mandates that you have to pay them on time. And there's obviously different definitions of what on time is. But there's one very interesting disclaimer, and that is that you only have to pay your workers on time if they've asked you for the payment. So if they haven't asked you for the payment, of course you are supposed to pay them on time, but you haven't yet transgressed the Torah's requirement until they've asked you for it. Because again, there's this incredible psychology. When I've done a job, and I feel that I've done it properly, then I feel that I have the right to approach you to pay me for it. So if I can ask you for that money, that is an endorsement of the fact that I did a good job. If I'm waiting for you to give it to me, that sounds like I'm waiting for your good graces. I haven't earned my keep. The minute I can put in a demand and say, what's happening? Where's my money? That means I'm coming from a perspective of confidence. I can be assertive. I can be proud of the fact that I've done what I was supposed to do. So the Gemara says it's not even good enough that the Egyptians should show them gracious attitude, but they actually have to be empowered to ask for this money and then receive it. So therefore Hashem says, go to your neighbors, request their gold and silver, which you'll check beforehand during the plague of darkness. And then when they respond to your request by giving it to you, that is the most profound form of compensation you could have. Because you're not just getting money in the bank, you're not just getting money with a smile, you're getting money that acknowledges your input, that acknowledges your efforts. Interesting nuance, by the way. When the Gemara says this, it says that the reason Hashem used the word please is because he doesn't want, and this time the Gemara does not say Avraham. It says Hashem does not want that tzaddik. Now we know who that tzaddik is. We know it's referring to Avraham because we know that's who Hashem negotiated with, and that's who Hashem made the promise to. But the Gemara does not use his name. The Gemara says, Hashem says, I don't want that tzaddik to complain, same complaint, that they went through the slavery, but I didn't fulfill the part of the promise that they'd get all the money. Why does the Gemara change the language and not refer to him as Avraham, but rather as that tzaddik? Because the Gemara wants to highlight the word tzaddik, which comes from the word tzedek, that which is correct and just and appropriate. Because the Gemara wants to highlight over here that the most just way that you help somebody who's been through something difficult like this is to make them feel that they've earned the compensation that they get. So that's the angle that we're coming from over here. So if we were to summarize what we've learned so far, is that there are two potential possibilities of how you're supposed to look at the story. Either it's all about punishing Egypt, and it's just just so happens that the Jewish people are the worthy recipients of the money we're going to punish Egypt by taking it away from them, or the focus is on the Jews themselves, that they deserve compensation. So the main thing is that they should be compensated, but technically that money's got to come from somewhere, so we're going to tax Egypt because they're the ones who enslaved them. We've now concluded that the clarity, both in the Midrash and in the Gemara, of how the story operates is that Hashem is primarily interested in the fact that the Jewish people should be compensated, because the Jewish people need to feel like all of those years were not wasted, that they actually did something that was meaningful, and therefore they're being given this money, and not only given the money, but they can demand the money. And that's why they have to go and ask the Egyptians for the gold and the silver. That will satisfy Avraham Avinu's concerns, and this will help us to understand what the spiritual nature of the slavery was all about, because up until now we've just spoken about their physical experiences and their physical compensation. But the truth is that this is a clue to the spiritual nature of what went on during the time that they were in Egypt, because there are two possible spiritual scenarios, one in which the focus is on the destruction of Egypt, and the other where the focus is on the development of the Jewish people. And based on what we've learned today, we'll see that the spiritual focus is the development of the Jewish people. And that's what we'll do, please God, next time, is to distinguish between these two possibilities, understand which one it was, and then appreciate what that means to us as we go about our business of living as Jewish people. Thank you, Rabbi.